G'day legends, I hope you are having a fantastic day and so far a brilliant start to your week. Now legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over, but even more than usual, of course, I updated you with an interview yesterday about Venezuela, China and America. So we do have 2 days to go over, but it has been a big few days. So of course, we'll look at the maps, we'll do the comparison of maps, look at geolocations, mainly around that southern Huliapol, Velika Novosilka front that not only is moving day after day after day, but we know the porosity of there. We do see troops popping up more than 5 kilometres behind the line, and this should be of major concern given the fortifications in there and the ability to flank around them. We'll look at strikes, systems, politics, a little bit of everything. We'll talk about Tomahawk missiles, we'll talk about Nord Stream, we'll look at fighter aircraft, we'll look at some alleged casualties as well off some PDF Excel spreadsheets. We'll talk about Zelensky's frustration with countries not putting in the amount of sanctions that would be possible, but we'll also then continue on my last Ukraine update to do with the global south. And if the US and the European states that they're not fully in, how can we really expect these global south countries, which may be closer to both maybe politically, militarily, or geographically to China, for them to go all in also? And then finally, we'll go over, of course, Merkel, the former Chancellor of Germany, and what she has said about there is some responsibility for other states outside of Russia for the war that we have seen, and then the Baltic meltdown that we have seen follow this. Shock, horror, I know. So legends, let's get into it. A lot today. I am sorry about how long this may be. Now, my last video, I spoke and showed you some footage about a FPV fiber optic Russian drone working within Kramatorsk. Now, I spoke to a dear friend of mine, but who is my go-to drone guy, and he's on absolutely the cutting edge of this technology. Now, what he said to me was, although this drone is 20 kilometres behind the forward line of troops, the operational range is more around 50 to 60 kilometres. He's also stated that Russia has pulled ahead of the drone game, mostly due to Western bureaucracy, making the ability to actually get a system into the field possible, where this bureaucracy to actually go through all the testing phases, the red tape, everything, to getting it into the field, but then also at scale is just so difficult. So we may see more of those long-range FPVs popping up. I have another drone guy who's going to be giving us some more information as well about then working at increased ranges. Now, just a side note on that, remember, radio signal and fiber optic ranges are very different. Remember, you could have 100 kilometres of fibre optic cable, but if you're flying back and forth like this, your distance from operator is massively reduced, unlike just a signal. But of course, it can't be jammed. Okay, let's then look at this. We have seen down in Crimea many long-range strikes from Ukrainian drones occurring, and we do see here that a radar for an S-400 system, these are the launchers, but then the radar, and looking like a command vehicle, has also been struck as well. Overall, the damage to that is unknown. That said, these are a particularly fragile system. The truck itself, these are armoured, but the systems themselves, as far as radars, can have significant damage to destroyed. Okay, let's have a look at this. Now, this has been going just everywhere, and I can't believe at this stage in the war, we're literally coming up on 4 years, people still fall for shit like this. Now, these forms here, these two spreadsheets behind my writing here, that this is just an Excel spreadsheet with some numbers on it, and people saying that what this shows is exactly the Russian losses. And again, what we need to do is apply this, that if it was then Russian pages releasing these Ukrainian losses and it was an Excel spreadsheet printed out and then taken a photo of, said to be by hackers, with nothing that actually looks real when there's incentive to release this also, if you wouldn't believe that, we need to be serious about this too. This has just as much authenticity, if not more, although there's probably some data out there to disprove that. But let's look at what Mr. Thorkill said. One of the lesser-known Ukrainian NGOs, I Want to Live project, of course, trying to get Russian soldiers to then leave their lines, come across. So as you can see, there's incentive here to show then higher CAS, WIA, MIA as well. 2 photographs allegedly showing secret Russian military documents concerning losses from the Russian army for the first 8 months. This was done, so just this year. There's no context, meaning without explaining exactly where these documents were obtained, how they were acquired, and who produced them. Subsequently, many different Twitter accounts, mostly linked to NATO, tried to sell these documents as something credible and noteworthy, one of them claiming to be a former Ukrainian soldier, even wrote at first glance, these documents look authentic. Now, what I will say, if it's a hacker, then why is it photographs of this? But I agree with Mr. Thorkill here, where he says in reality, at first glance, is that documents appear completely fake. The first thing that stands out, of course, lack of signatures. If it's a military document, top right corner, both pages should contain the document's classifications, secret, classified, whatever it will have, a sequence of numbers and letters internally identifying the document's producer, and a number of copies of documents like this. And as you can see, this would have an incredibly high classification rating. Other doubts concern the content itself. The document provides a detailed breakdown of losses by the Russian army corps, groups and armies. He talks about then it's unclear why some of these are repeated. The table describing alleged material losses is actually nonsensical because it is completely generic. I assure you that no senior Russian military headquarters would create such a table in this form, but would instead produce a separate one with 50 columns detailing each type of lost military equipment. In summary, this looks like similar propaganda spin to the early one on the Russian side, that 1.7 mil that we saw, related to these documents allegedly stolen by Russian hackers from the Ukrainian general staff regarding then their losses. So in my opinion, there is no reason to get excited about it. But what do you mean a spreadsheet with nothing else confirming this is fake? Now, what I've seen is the page who has posted this, they said the data on losses has come into our hands, and then over 243 days, there is 281,500 killed, wounded, and missing in action. Funnily enough, I actually believe that is lower than the Ukrainian General Staff's number, but still, what I say about numbers is everything on numbers you just have to take with a grain of salt. The best we have is like your media zone or UA losses. That is to confirm they're going to be lower, of course, but other than this, it has as much authenticity. Look, it could be real, but if you're relying on information that doesn't have any signature blocks, any classification, the data's nonsensical, all of that, we can't be sinking ourselves to that amount because you wouldn't take it on the other side of that. Right, let's look at Tomahawks. Now, Trump, the other day in the White House, he said this. This would have been for the update yesterday, and then we'll go on what Ukraine has said about this.
On whether to supply Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine or sell them to NATO.
Will you supply them to Ukraine or sell them to NATO? And Trump says,
sell them to Ukraine.
Yeah, I've sort of made a decision, pretty much. If you consider, I think I want to find out what they're doing with them.
Yes.
Where are they sending them? I guess I'd have to ask that question. That war.
So he's pretty much made a decision. He wants to know where they are sending them. Now, today, this gentleman, Yehov Cherniev, the deputy chair of Ukrainian Parliament's National Security and Defence Committee, he has then put this on his Facebook, which is, of course, getting now reshared everywhere. And this seems to be the most amount of information that we've actually got from anyone specifically about Tomahawks. Now, what I will say about Tomahawks is no single weapon system in war is a wonder weapon. These will increase the cost. They will increase lethality. But again, in a war like this, it needs to be en masse and it needs to be simultaneous and successive, as we always say. Let's look at what this gentleman says. Regarding Trump's decision to give us Tomahawks, things won't go as quickly as you wanted because this is, first of all, the means of pressure on Putin and an effort to force him to negotiate and only then strengthening our military capacity. So again, this idea of that we need to put pressure to force Putin to come to the table on our terms. Things won't go as quickly as you wanted. Then many are saying it's going to be at least several months. And several months' time, we're going through winter and strap in and see how this goes. Trump did not accidentally say he almost decided he did not want escalation and that he wanted to specify how these missiles would be used. So these stages are clearly defined. I can change my mind and not supply, but I will but not allow to use. I can only allow to use for specific purposes and so on. So Trump sort of drip feeding in what Ukraine can do with these. So at each one of these stages, Putin will be given the opportunity to retreat and go to negotiations, and therefore the supply and use of missiles will most likely be very gradual. So fire some in and, okay, you can retreat now, you can go to negotiations on all of our terms. First, they'll give us rockets, but only a few. couple of dozen, but they'll not allow us to shoot them at once, and we will see the Kremlin's reaction. And as far as I'm aware, this first step of what he's talking about will be only within occupied region. If there's no reaction, we can hit a few on the Russian border. If Putin after that does not go to negotiations, we will be able to increase the radius a little and supplies will increase a little. So more of them, go further. The radius and use of supply missiles will increase as Putin continues to escalate the war. And finally, only after some time, all restrictions will be lifted, except perhaps strikes on the Kremlin and directly on Putin. This whole epic could take at least a few months, but is already real pressure and a real argument. So he's saying they are coming. Now, what I will say is I'm unsure if Trump knows about this plan in of himself, but as well, there's a problem with this. The problem with drip feeding in is that the air defense systems, they will, and the crews will start actually learning and developing how to counter these. Now, what I will say is these systems, your S-300s, S-400s, S-500s, these systems were developed specifically for weapon systems like the Tomahawks. This is why I've said I still think overall you're better off in large amounts of drones. We have seen how from Patriot systems through to all the Western air defense and the Russian air defense, they really struggle just against mass of drones. But of course, we will see in this, it's being heralded as the new wonder weapon. What we will see when it comes in, if Ukraine hasn't already been training behind the scenes and have got them, it's going to be many months before we even see the first ones fired. And as well as these are typically launched off naval platforms, there are ground-based launches for them. There are very few of them. So, of course, they will be at risk too. So, again, we will see. I get asked every single day what I think about these long-range strategic strikes. And what I say every time is history has never shown us a war that has been won or lost purely off strategic strikes. That this is a battlefield multiplier. It needs to still be done in conjunction with tactical actions and also political diplomacy too. But that war is a holistic view. You're not going to win off one thing. You're not going to win off just having the best tanks. You're not going to win off just this. It's a whole state at war. The other thing is too, and I know Mearsheimer talks about this and other military academics speak of this too, well, he's more political academic, but you know what I mean, that about in modern times, these large states just have so much industry that there would never be enough systems to hit them. Now, I think drones have somewhat changed that calculation. I spoke about this with China, Taiwan, that what happens if realistically, if China fires 100,000 Iran-style drones day on day for a week, how does that look? Okay, we haven't seen that previously, but we're not talking about that here. Okay, now let's look at Russia's most important aircraft, the Su-34. So UAC, as you know, I keep up to date and see how these are being delivered. And as we know, more aircraft are being delivered than are being lost. 2 more Su-34s have gone to the Russian Air Force. But we do see fighter bomber. Here's pushback on this, that the Su-34 is training for its future owners. And we can see this desert camouflage here. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the only international partner getting these weapons for Russia is Algeria, is getting the Su-34. But he's saying he's not really happy about this, that we need these planes every day. Pay them back for these in gold or diamonds or whatever. And the laws we self-invented, we can't send weapons and exports to suppress weapons ourselves in terms of technical characteristics. These are a new variant. These are Su-34M going. So he's not happy about these then being exported to other nations while they are needed for Russia drop, of course, those Fab Glide missions. And I have said the Su-34, in my opinion, is the most important aircraft. And what we have seen is there is no real way to actually intercept these. We've seen one go down by being intercepted literally like in the last 6 or 7 months. So let's look at Nord Stream. Now, Nord Stream, it was the biggest story at the time and then went awfully silent awfully quickly. But we know Germany, it cost Germany billions and billions of dollars, not only in loss of ability for energy security, but also then their taxpayers. In Germany, they're really the only ones who have done any serious investigation into this, but also Germany, the most powerful nation in Europe, in the EU. It's not in Poland's interest to give Germany the Nord Stream suspect. Now, the Nord Stream suspect is Mr. Vladimir Z, not the Vladimir Z, a Vladimir Z. Actually, for a side note, imagine if it was the Vladimir Z. But Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said ultimately it was for the court to decide whether Vladimir Z, who was detained near Warsaw, is handed over. But he's saying that it is certainly not in the interest to Poland to hand over this citizen to a foreign country or within the European Union. The problem of Europe, the problem of Ukraine, the problem of Lithuania and Poland is not that the Nord Stream 2 was blown up, but it was built. Okay, you could say this. But again, how is it going for you for your so-called rules-based order, sovereignty, independence, all of this within the European Union when we're blowing things up? Now, should have it not been built? Yeah, probably. Ukraine had problems not getting money for the gas flowing through their territory. It's going through then the sea. But this is what we're getting at, and this is the foundations of the EU have been falling apart. The foundations of democracy, they have been completely just undermined by the entire EU, and then we're seeing things like this, where we see a very powerful state like Germany, what happened there, is it an attack on that? Yes. So I think this could get more and more messy, especially with the way we see German politics is having a shift. Polish court ruled on Monday that Vladimir Z must remain in custody for another 40 days while the decision is made whether to transfer him to Germany based on a European arrest warrant, so inter-European. Now, they say this marked an escalation when the Nord Stream was blown up in the Ukraine conflict and squeezed energy supplies. No one has taken responsibility for the blast, and Ukraine has denied any role. Now, he is accused of conspiring to commit an explosive attack and anti-constitutional sabotage on those systems. Now, this story about Nord Stream, I don't think this is done. I think even if it went silent for a couple of years, when we see changes within Germany, I think this could come back to the forefront. It was very major. If you want to know how severe it was, look at how people like von der Leyen spoke about it when it first happened versus when it became more and more clear. Okay, let's have a look at the maps. We have a couple of days to go over, but first we need to start with a change that Sursky has made. That he's disbanded the Dnipro Operational Strategic Group, formerly known as Koalicja. Now, this strategic group was responsible for a significant stretch of the front line from Zaporizhia to Kharkiv. This Major General Drapati headed the group for 8 months, according to the article. He will retain his post as Joint Force Commander along with his team, but relocate to the northeastern front. One of the sources here for Ukrainska Pravda has said that this is an experienced officer described as a way to remove a competitor. And what we do know, we get a lot of anonymous complaints that Sursky is absolutely trying to micromanage. And also we have seen competitors, people, very confident people like Zaluzny moved out because they are a competitor. A quote from a colonel. On the one hand, this is a logical step because the operational strategic group layer is disappearing. And it should disappear with the transition to the core. But on the other hand, this step change is nothing because Sursky still commands everything. What reforms? Not a single corps is commanding its full set of troops. No one has the authority to maneuver. We tried to get rid of tactical groups, but now they've created another one in the setup Bryankia Forest. So let's go over who this guy was. That on August 11th, Deep State Ukrainian military analysis reported that Russian forces had intensified their advance near Dobropilya. That, of course, Pokrovsk east-northeast sector. The Dnipro operational group started on Pokrovsk and Dobropilya front, small group of soldiers that they had breached the first line, but hadn't actually had control of this. Now, we've seen that on June 1, and this happens just again and again and again, missile strikes on training areas, killing at least a dozen, injuring more than 60. The same day he submitted his resignation, he later stated he would remain in service after speaking to Zelensky, and that now he's been appointed as Joint Forces Commander from Zelensky. So in the high echelon of this too, there is a lot of friction, a lot of problems, and a lot of competition sort of getting pushed away as well as there is a flip to the core structure. Again, how will that go? Well, we will see. There's this hybrid style trying to be NATO, Soviet tactics is very, very difficult. Now, let's actually have a look at the maps. We have 2 days to go over. We're going to start down in the south, of course. Here is Ukraine, the center of screen, the capital of Kyiv, the red areas, occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Of course, we have this front line here, the Velika Novosilka / Huliapol front as this continues moving. Now, this was the Deep State update yesterday showing movement to the north of Poltavka and around Voronezh. Now we'll move up to today, and we do see a major shift here. We see Malinivka, most of this coming under control, movement into Poltavka in the direction of Pavlivka. So this is significant, this stepping up day after day after day. This is up, say, 2.5 kilometres. What I will always say is go and walk 2.5 kilometres in a straight line, not around the block, do it in a straight line. You'll get an idea of the advancement of this. In my opinion, these areas on this map is still well behind where it is actually sitting. So let's have a look at a couple of other maps in here. So we'll come up just to the north. See where this grey is saying Oleksivka? Okay. Deep State, they've shown this footage of Russian forces in Oleksivka. Now, it says the enemy is taking advantage of the weather conditions, the fog, to move in here. It says that a few were killed. But again, this gives us some 5+ kilometres from the Flot into Oleksivka, 5-ish kilometres, just over, I would say. And this shows the porosity of this front line and how there's no like solid line in here, and that there are failures of the fortifications, and this is moving again and again and again. And what we have spoken about is how dangerous this becomes in the direction of Pokrovskoye and to the north of Huliapol, in behind those fortified lines, which are for a northern advancement. Keep an eye on this sector. This sector may be able to reintroduce manoeuvre before others. Again, we will see. But as the south deteriorates more, the only ever military plan, as I shared with you, the military plan for Ukraine was to seize the south and cut off Kherson and Crimea. And this is becoming more and more unlikely by these movements here. So let's look over a couple of other things. So we have the situation on the Huliapol front from Mr. Suryak Maps, that the Russian army, they are approaching the Yuncha River and the outskirts of Novoselivske, Novomagalivka, and Okhotnichny. Meanwhile, Russian forces reached the river inside Poltavka and is trying to reach the centre of the locality. In addition, they began an assault on Novohorovka. So, of course, down in Poltavka, in the direction of Novohorovka, and as you can see, these maps are showing, of course, Surak is showing a further western advancement, basically where the grey zone is, but it does confirm that there is further advancement in here. But let's have a look at a geolocation before then I show you the Playfra's map. So we have just to the east of Uspanivka, this Novoselivske, this is what Surak was talking about. We have a couple of Russian flags going up, geo-confirmed in here, as you can see. So these are just close enough to sitting right here, back from the line, say a mile, 1.6 kilometres. So this is continually moving and even outside of the grey zone in a lot of areas. Now, I know there are a lot of flag-waving missions in here and blah, 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 but what we do see is again and again and again, Russia able to continue expanding control. Even if it is forward and back, it is multiple steps forward. It's 3 steps forward, 1 step back. It's not 3 steps forward, 3 steps back. Now, let's have a look at what Mr. Playfra has said. Now, what we need to look for is Pavlivka, Uspanivka area. So we have Uspanivka, Pavlivka in here, and you can see very quickly from Novohorovka all the way through. So this sector down to Pavlivka, he's saying that this is coming further under Russian control. When I still couldn't post about specifics, the situation is much worse for the Ukrainians than what is shown on public maps, even the pro-Russian maps. He's saying it is worse, that there's more ground through Novohorovka, that they control this area, and that part of Uspanivka they control on the side as well. Regarding the Russian flags in this area, which is not published yet, but which might publish soon, it's also the case with Russian flags. Often with Ukrainian flags, the village is not under their control. That what we've spoken about, that forward and back. But furthermore, there's at least a contingent of Russian forces that penetrated into Uspanivka. This happened already yesterday. So into Uspanivka, keep an eye on this sector. It is being largely ignored, of course, but it is very significant. Now, let's move our way up into one of the other very important areas of Kupiansk. Now, we can see the grey zone around here. This isn't moving for some time, but let's have a look here. This is what Mr. Suryak is saying. So just to give you an idea, we see where these then last remaining roads come in and how there is a crossing of this reaching then the north to south road. That Russian DRG activity, they're consolidated some forces in here and controlling the central markets under their control, as well as the bus station. So again, approximately 200 Ukrainian soldiers are at risk of encirclement in the northwestern sector of Kupiansk. So again, it's a difficult situation to get an idea, but you can see where these red prongs are coming out, and this is shown as well on this map in here. So keep an eye on this. This, of course, with the crossing the lost skill, could be a very, very difficult situation to try and get troops actually out of here. While we're in the north, let's go into Volchansk. No changes shown on this map, but we have seen a lot of maps showing more changes within Volchansk and that Russia is increasing control in here. So keep an eye on that. We're also seeing a lot more strikes in here too, what would tell us that they are trying to make some amount of ground. Okay, we'll move our way down. We'll work north to south. We have, of course, the Terny, northern Seversk area, as you can see in here. We have Novoselivskaya. We have Stavkay areas to just be familiar with for a second. We have increased ground around Novoselivskaya by the Russian forces, just in around this sector here, just in between Novoselivskaya and Chandrilahove. We have Stavkay, see where these roads then have a cross intersection as well, that the Russians have supposedly reached this cross intersection down to Stavkay. So by Suryak's map, Stavkay to out here, some 5 kilometers from the axes of here, or that won't reach from there, but a couple of kilometers from the Kolodiaze front, and also increased control from Zadachne heading west. This is all this Liman flank, Seversk pocket. This is this sort of double bubble envelopment that is occurring at the moment. So keep an eye on that. While we're in Seversk, we're going to go down into the south, Vremimkia, Zvanivkia area. Now, I don't see like anyone talking about how this is moving. Small bit of control being made just to the south of Zvanivkia by Suryak map. So this is just down in this sector right in here. But then I have a geolocation to show you as well, confirming this movement. So we see just where this creek runs through here, or this river system up in here, that we have seen Russian forces operating in here. Now, it's not confirming red, but it's confirming definitely it is at grey. How far behind is this? It's right in here, some say 3 kilometres back. So you get an idea of where these maps are sitting and are not sitting. Now, before we go into Pokrovsk, which is our last map, let's go back to yesterday's. We did have on the Konstantinivka front, more ground being made by the Russian forces in the direction of Alexandro Shultne. Now, in my opinion, from basically Stopochke through to here, has been under control for some time. Okay, let's come down into Pokrovsk and Pokrovsk, actual Pokrovsk north. So let's come to today. We don't see any changes on here. You can see where it is said that these areas are cut off. To get a good idea in here is very, very difficult. So let's look at the Pokrovsk northeastern area straight off the bat. And we do have a little bit of different mapping on here. So on this front, Russian army recaptured the localities of Pankivka and Nikhorovka. On the other hand, map corrections were made northeast of Rusin Yar in favour of the Ukrainian army. So Rusin Yar, this is just in this sector in here, saying that these areas still somewhat under control of the Ukrainian army, but he's talking in here, which was never shown as red, but he's saying Nikhorovka has come back under control of the Russian forces, Nikhorovka and Pankivka, so down in here. But then we have AMK. He says that Dorozhne, Dobropilia, has been back under the control of Ukraine. So Dorozhne in here, which of course shown outside, but we did know for some time was likely under Russian control. So again, there's still a lot of movement in here. It's very, very unclear exactly how this looks at this point in time. Let's come down into Pokrovsk. Actual, we see where grey zone is heading down into the southern regions and into the western side also, and the DRGs are still operating within Pokrovsk. And you can see by Suryak's map more break-in into this, what's called Shakarsky on the south. This is the important area we're going to speak about in the south in Shakarsky, but also on the western side, and also, of course, up to this train line as well. So he's saying up to the train line where my cursor is, but in the Shakarsky region in the south. Now let's look at what Mr. Playfarer says about Shakarsky and showing this advancement and grey moving in here. That the high-rise buildings of Pokrovsk are not only still in decent condition and positions can be established there, but they also have very good basements below them where they can hide extremely effectively and accumulate safely. Civilians still remaining in the city are also a big problem. There are cases where they help hide Russian soldiers. This is more common than you would actually think. The remaining people in a lot of these areas may not be on the side of the Ukrainian forces there. I know this firsthand from in Bakhmut and also to the north of Kharkiv. So if they were able to gain a stable foothold in Shakarsky, it would be very hard to knock them out. So high rise there, reasonable conditions, basement still there. Maybe overall this was why FABs maybe didn't hit those specific buildings, because it may have been seen as more of a probe to be able to get into them than having Ukraine hold them. Again, we'll see. About whoever draws Russians stably into the centre of the city, it is straight up not true. So mappers that are showing straight into the centre, he's saying, no, this isn't true. That there definitely have been noticed there, but again, it's more these DRGs, it's not consolidation. It's hard to defend this part of the city because mostly low-rise residential buildings, so in the parts centre north. And the situation is difficult. Again, when the situation is difficult, we know that's really bad. But what needs to be stressed is that the main movements are still characteristical of infiltrations more than anything. This, though, might change at any moment. We know this is ultimately an envelopment that is then squeezing down, but these DRGs are creating a chaos in the centre here for everything from supply lines through to blue on blues, through to distrust, drones, and also, of course, calling fires. Big problems. Pokrovsk, the story of Pokrovsk hasn't even really begun yet. Now, legends, I believe that is all the mapping that we have. And we're going to continue on our last Ukraine update today and then look at what Zelensky is saying too. So I began this article the other day with Putin in charge. Russia's vassalage to China will only deepen, and this will be a continuation of that. And the trade with the West, even if it was to reopen, it couldn't backfill what China now has. Before 2014, 80% of Russia's trade was with the West, 10% with China. The bulk investment in technology in Russia came from the EU and the US. Today, Beijing accounts for more than 30% of Russia's export revenues and provides 40% of imports, including goods to fuel the Kremlin's war machine for China. Russia's footprint is smaller, thus replaceable, just 3% and 5% of exports and 5% of last year. So for China, Russia is not as important as China is for Russia. Okay, I think everyone knows that. But again, that isn't the whole story. As Russia's estrangement from the West deepens, China's role as a lifeline to Putin's system is only set to grow. When Putin turned his back on the West a decade ago, he had to fill the void with China. But now, even if for some reason he could pivot away from Beijing, there was no credible alternative. No other country can simultaneously provide Russia with a giant market for its commodities, modern technology, logistical proximity, and financial tools to circumvent Western sanctions, all without questions asked about the brutal war the Kremlin is waging against Ukraine. So he's saying no one could backfill it while these sanctions are still in place. What I've said is I think we could see this lifted very quickly to try and reduce the rise of China. In theory, this should be deeply unsettling for any pragmatic decision maker in the Kremlin, putting all your eggs in one basket, with this being China. That said, we have the other side of this, which is now all of Europe's eggs are in the American basket now that energy sovereignty and independence is gone, and no one's even allowed to investigate if you ask the Polish Prime Minister. He says this, that Putin is no pragmatic decision maker, and the deepening vassalage to China is his own choice. What I will say is I don't think this gentleman who is writing this, who is an academic in the field of this, I don't think he understands how the world is shifting. Now, Putin may have made irresponsible decisions, but again, they were decisions based on then after the fact appear to be irresponsible. But everyone agreed that Ukraine would fall very quickly, from the Kremlin to Washington to Kyiv. Now, the rationality of that was solid. Of course, after the fact, it was proven to be incorrect. But the rationality behind that was solid. Same as the rationality of then the German force in the Second World War, that the Soviets, due to purges, wouldn't be able to stop the Blitzkrieg. It was sound rationality. We just see it after the fact as that it didn't make sense. But at the time, the rationale was sound. What I will say is Putin is very, very calculated. This doesn't mean that you don't miscalculate. But again, he is very calculated, and the world is shifting. There's this idea of that it's going to be the West and the rest still, rather than this rise of the global South. We're going to look at what Zelensky says about this. Even if Washington chooses to restore bilateral economic ties with Russia, it won't be able to substitute the basically $250 million trade with China. Currently, US-Russia trade stands at $3.5 billion, mostly in uranium, and the 2011 record of $45 billion is ancient history. American businesses don't plan to go back to Putin's Russia. I wouldn't be so sure on that when you're talking about these giants in resources. Anyway, in Europe, which is the only player that can help Russia out of the lopsided China dependency, there is little appetite to go back to pre-war levels of economic reliance on the Kremlin. Now, what I will say again is states, even if they're liberal, they act as realists, and the US, they didn't want to align with Stalin either. But when a larger threat was evolving, you see that's all pushed to the side to go at that. And what I've said is, yes, that we say Russia is the enemy and Putin and this and that, and we can't buy anything. But if there's a way to reduce China's dominance and regional hegemony by getting Russia back into the fold, we see this from things like the Australian Strategic and Policy Institute saying there needs to be open up back because China and Russia scratching each other's backs is very, very powerful. And these numbers of what is supplied to China get of 3%, 5% to Russia, this doesn't show what the actual these numbers don't give the real calculation of how important Russia is for China, because a lot of this is uncalculable. But as far as technology in the Arctic, anti-submarine, submarine, conventional warfare experience, as well as ability to go to ports, which you can't really put a percentage on, but it is incredibly important, especially conventional warfare experience. The only player that's helping Putin to avoid a near total dependency on China is India, which buys about 40% of Russian oil exports. Today is actually Putin's birthday, and the front page of all Indian media is basically wishing Putin a happy birthday from Modi. Ironically, if the Trump administration ultimately succeeds in forcing New Delhi to decrease its reliance on Russian imports, it will only boost the Kremlin's reliance on China even further. And as Beijing has powerful tools to retaliate, particularly its rare earth export controls, should the US attempt to pressure it, it would be foolish to expect Xi will throw his junior partner under the bus. For Beijing, Russia's growing vassalage to China, wrapped in diplomacy, flattery between the leaders, and shared animosity towards the US global leadership, has plenty to recommend it. Also, the ability to supply all the resources ever needed to dominate, and not only that, but also give China an arm of power, not only north into the Arctic, but also west into Europe, Eurasia region. Okay, that is. You can't calculate in a percentage the importance of this, but this is like the US, that the US needs NATO and the EU as much as they need it, because then it would be an isolated island without power into Europe and Asia. The Kremlin's growing dependency on Beijing is here to stay, and we have spoken about that. There is and should be concern. We know from leaked FSB documents or alleged documents, there is some concern within Russia about too much reliance on China and trying to gain more power inside of Russia. But also, we know there's a lot of concern in different strategic studies too about Russia and China working together. Massive resource-heavy state, massive populous state. Those working together is very, very is a massive challenge to the Western dominance, hegemony, I may say, but as far as maintaining the status quo. So let's look at what Zelensky has said here. And Zelensky, he has made a number of tweets really calling out these countries just not doing enough. It talks about these strikes, these continued Russian strikes, and Russia sells its energy resources and then uses that money exclusively for war. The pressure from Western countries today is just not enough, nor is there enough unity to apply that pressure. We need more pressure from the US, from Europe. As for the global south, we do not yet even feel their pressure on Russia to make it stop. So there's no pressure, he's saying, that we can even feel from the global south. We'll go over why that isn't there. They cannot be allowed to feel comfortable, they being the Russians. And when they no longer feel comfortable, they will begin to raise questions with their leadership. Again, this isn't what history shows us, though, about strategic strikes. Strategic strikes tend to cement support rather than have revolutions. Churchill is the best one to talk about this. Now, Zelensky, again, that certain countries cut off blatantly reprehensible schemes of supplying Russia with critical components for the production of missiles and drones. Putin does not know how to wage war without terror. Russia would not have a single missile or most of its drones, and therefore would not be able to cause significant damage to our energy sector if they were unable to purchase or somehow import Western-made components for missiles and then drones. So he's saying that you guys are responsible for these coming in. Unfortunately, many critical components are still being supplied to Russia from Europe and the US, but hundreds of thousands of components, purely commercial supplies. And then we see refusing to make peace. The world has the power to stop terror, any terror, and Russia is no exception. Now, I have no doubt there's a lot of dual-use items within these weapon systems. The question needs to be, can this actually be stopped? Can it be reasonably stopped? Because as long as trade continues with China, India, other partners in the South, these may still be able to cross over. A lot of these components are just dual-use chips and items, cameras, whatever. If trade is stopped, so the way to stop this, say, would be, okay, there's no trade with China. Zero, okay? Firstly, economic meltdown, rare earth, big problems. Let's theoretically say that. If that trade is stopped, Ukraine will then almost have zero drones. We talk about India. Well, the amount of diesel going into Ukraine, the majority of it, I believe, is coming from India. So there's a lot in this. But the bit I wanted to touch on was this about we don't even feel pressure from the global south. And this touched on it really well the other day. We speak about how any hopes that Trump made in forming an alliance against China can be written off. Zelensky meeting with Ukraine's allies at the European summit couldn't eclipse the visuals from Putin's trip to China. And then, of course, before that, him with Trump. Then we see what's impossible now to imagine representatives of the global south at European meetings in support of Ukraine, even among minority shareholders. Indeed, why would they bother when the United States is distancing itself from support of the besieged country? And this is the thing, is you're asking the global south, countries which are more reliant on these other nations, some less independent, closer geographically, politically, culturally, however, to these other states, you're asking them to stand more support while the US is distancing themselves as well. And even European countries like Slovakia or Hungary or maybe even the Czech, that they're distancing themselves. It's a lot now to ask Indonesia, or when people said Mongolia should then arrest when Putin landed there, when they're squeezed between China and Russia. So this is the thing, getting the global south on board is going to be very difficult if the US is pulling away. Now let's look at Merkel, comments that she has made. Now, we'll go off the Telegraph one here, but we'll have a look over some different articles too. Merkel, Poland and Baltics, partially responsible for Ukraine invasion. Former German Chancellor claims country's opposition to negotiations with Moscow fueled Russian aggression. And what we did see is there was no real effort to really stop this war as well, either through force of then militarizing Ukraine to the ability that Russia wouldn't come in, or diplomatically either. And with everything, people won't like this, but it does take two to tango. That is not justification. It's not justification, but it's also explaining the situation. Poland and the Baltic states bear some of the blame for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Angela Merkel suggested. Interview, Ms. Merkel, who served as German Chancellor from 2005 to 2021, claimed that Polish and Baltic resistance to EU-led negotiations with Vladimir Putin in 2021 indirectly contributed to his aggression a year later. In 2021, I feel that Putin was no longer taking the Minsk agreement seriously. That's why I wanted a new format where we could speak directly to Putin as the European Union. So something to actually start conversation and speak with the nuclear neighbour on our borders. Former Chancellor was referring to the Minsk Accords, a series of failed international treaties that sought to end the Donbas war between Ukraine and Russia, a prelude to the invasion. Not everyone supported this, above all the Baltic states. But Poland was also against it. In any case, it did not happen. I left office and then Putin's aggression begun. He said that lockdowns meant in-person regular negotiations could not happen, and that if you could not meet, you couldn't discuss differences face-to-face, you find new compromises. And how much impact has the spicy flu had when even leaders wouldn't meet, you couldn't meet with your boss, all of this too. That is a pathetic excuse for world leaders and now the war that we are in. But what we know is that the Baltics, Poland, they have gone nuts over this. And I think they've actually taken this like way further than Merkel was saying. Like Merkel saying, hey, look, there was aggression here. We didn't have meetings here. There was no ability to compromise on anything. No diplomacy was allowed. And I think they've taken it that far that now they're suggesting Merkel's sitting up in the bloody Kremlin somewhere. So Political says Merkel blasted by Baltics Poland for suggesting they share blame for Russia's Ukraine invasion. She explained the countries had been afraid and would not have a common policy towards Russia. In any case, it didn't happen, and I left office. That's when the aggression began. Directly contradicting Merkel, former Latvian Prime Minister, this person, said on Monday that at the same time many countries had not understood Russia, including Germany, as the former Chancellor herself. That you guys don't understand this. I consistently told her you cannot deal with Putin in good faith, but she believed the Baltic states were wrong. I was well aware of Merkel's views, and I'm astonished that after everything that has happened in Ukraine, she still thinks this way. So saying you can't trust them, nothing he says you can take in any account, blah, 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 blah. So there's no reason to have any conversations, and she still doesn't understand this. Continuing, Putin acts the way he acts, And the only options for West are either to submit or resist. It is surprising that former German Chancellor would say something like this today, when it should be obvious to everyone that what kind of regime Russia is. I'm glad the new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, doesn't share Merkel's views, although Merz too has been a very soft-handed approach. Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tashka said on Monday that Russia bore sole responsibility for the conflict. Russia's war against Ukraine is driven by one thing only: its refusal to accept the Soviet Union's collapse and unrelenting imperialist ambitions. Russia alone is to blame for this aggression. Now, this fundamental in this, I disagree that is the only drive for this. Putin himself has spoken about to want the Soviet Union back would be brainless. But you don't have a heart, but you wouldn't have a brain, whatever the specific quote was. We know that there was many different factors to this war, from the seen as moving and encroachment of modernity of NATO, whatever. But again, this justification and explanation are put as synonymous. You can say, hey, look, it was this. It's not justified in doing that, but he saw it as a threat. We didn't see it as a threat. You start getting the idea. And how many times have we crossed very similar lines due to saying that there is a threat? Merkel's comments have caused a barrage of reactions in Poland. So I'll touch on that again, is you don't get to say what is or isn't a threat to someone, but also you don't get then to impede on someone's independence. But again, international politics at the end of the day works as power politics, even if we don't like to say that it does. Former Polish Prime Minister, this person, now deputy head of the opposition Law and Justice Party, said on X, Angela Merkel, through her thoughtless interview, proved that she is among the most harmful German politicians in Europe in the past century. Harmful German politicians in the Europe past century? Okay. Poland should probably know better than anyone about that. And I've seen many people saying the worst chancellor Germans ever had. Okay, then. This Polish, whatever this is here, said when Merkel says she wanted to reach an agreement with Putin again, it would probably have led to the petition of Ukraine. But they don't understand, but don't do business with Putin. They brought about the war. I'm going to wonder when this war ends and how this war ends. If it is worse than any of these deals would have been made, even if there is, it was some sort of capitulation, I wonder how they're going to explain this away, or they just won't. They'll ignore it and no one will remember it. Former Polish ambassador to Russia, current Minister of Regional Policy for the centrist 2050 party, observed Merkel's statements only fueled Russian propaganda, suggesting blame for the war. Somehow didn't sit down with Russia on time and didn't bow enough to Moscow is absurd. It would have been even worse. So saying that it would have been even worse if we did sit down then. Okay. The Polish ambassador to the US criticised the media for twisting Merkel's words. The former chancellor only says the Baltics and Poland did not agree to an EU format in talks with Russia. From that statement, the formulation of Poland is co-responsible for Putin's war is quite a long way. So the formulation that it is co-responsible and what she actually said is being misconstrued. Now, what I'll say, huge surprise that the Baltics are cracking the shits. And I think they've massively overblown these comments. And again, explanation, justification, and responsibility, they're not synonymous with each other. Okay? And if you can't see a difference in this, this is why we are seeing European politics absolutely fall apart. And the fundamentals of, from democracy to liberalism to diplomacy, absolutely non-existent. And this is why I've said your great state powers in this, or potential great state powers like France and Germany, long-term could start moving away from this, going, well, we're fucking sick of these small countries having so much say over us and this, while we're all the money in here, 25% or more is from us, from our population, and we can't do anything. I do think the current EU that we're seeing, I think is going to be very short-lived overall, especially as we see countries re-weaponizing. We see this here. This gives you an idea. The former Foreign Minister of Lithuania is saying, our leaders hope Putin will give up. He will not, unless deterred. His escalation will increase until a Pearl Harbor moment forces us all to realise it's a war. Why do you think that I've been very scared of a false flag happening? We will then fight back half prepared, wishing we'd listened to more people and who saw all this coming. So, again, there's a lot in that. But of course, if you suggest anything other than this crazed old man with stage 4 cancer in the Kremlin, if you suggest anything other than that, you're suddenly responsible, accountable, and having justification for the war. Now, I have said multiple times, I do not think that this war is just at all, and responsibility and accountability need to be laid there as well. But if in the stage of international great power politics, you can see how this begins. As we have said, there would be zero just cause for America to start impeding on Mexico if China wanted to create some level of a military alliance and move in on that. And China has historically has less, in the last century, far less examples of moving across and flipping regimes than America has. If there was a move, or NATO, if there was a movement into Mexico, absolutely we would see actions. It's not justifying it, and it says that responsibility and accountability needs to be laid where it is. But we need to be realistic about this too, or else what we're going to see is we're going to see more of this. And the death of reasonable diplomacy has just gone, or anyone who can actually be able to step back and say, hey, look at all of this. Merkel makes some few very benign comments, and you see what has happened here, that now she is basically seen as an enemy of the state. And this is where, I explained it more on a podcast recently, the EU has gone from your typical democracy, bureaucracy that we have seen practicing, to what I believe is now total democracy, where we have enshrined truths, and if you step outside of those truths, then you are seen as an enemy to the state. That's how I see it. Legends, look after yourselves. Thank you for sticking with me if you're here still. Have a great day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.